Now, and we'll start. Give it a few minutes to give folks time to log in. Some messages up here. All right. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica from Greenlight and I could not be more excited to host tonight's event with Jim Shepard presenting his new book, Phase 6. He's going to be talking with Ethan Rutherford tonight, so you are in for an excellent time. Before we start, I want to say a huge thanks to Jim and Ethan and the team at Knopf for making this happen and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces right now, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Couple little housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see and hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen. There are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post a question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like 2 speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And very importantly, tonight's featured book, Phase 6, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Jim's book and many others on site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for quick pickup in the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop the buy link in the chat in a few moments. Jim actually stopped by our store this morning to sign copies of the book, so you can get a signed copy of Phase 6 by request while supplies last. Please make sure to indicate your signed copy request in the order comments at checkout when you order online, or look for signed copies when you stop by. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Okay, introductions. Our interviewer tonight is Ethan Rutherford. His fiction has appeared in Bomb, Tin House, Plowshares, One Story, and the Best American Short Stories, among many other places. His first short story collection, The Peripatetic Coffin, was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award for First Fiction and the winner of a Minnesota Book Award, among other honors. His second collection, Farthest, was published by A Strange Object in April 21. I am actually in the middle of reading it right now, and it is strange and wonderful and great, and you can get it from Greenlight. Ethan was born in Seattle and received his MFA in creative writing from the University of Minnesota and now teaches creative writing at Trinity College. He's also a former bookseller. Ethan and I worked together at the incomparable 3 Lives bookstore in the West Village in Manhattan years ago, too many years to figure out, and it's really great to be able to hang out again. He lives now in Hartford, Connecticut with his wife and 3 sons. We're happy he could join us tonight. He is going to be speaking with our featured author, Jim Shepard. He's the author of 7 previous novels, most recently the Book of Aron, which won numerous awards and which he presented with Greenlight at an amazing dinner event back in 2015, and 5 short story collections, including Like You to Understand Anyway, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and won the Story Prize. His short fiction has appeared in, among other magazines, The New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, McSweeney's, The Paris Review, and The Atlantic, and has often been selected for the Best American Short Stories and the PEN O. Henry Prize Stories. He lives in Williamstown, Massachusetts with his wife, 3 children, and 3 beagles, and he teaches at Williams College. And we've been grateful to have Jim on our stage often before in person and now on the virtual stage. And every time he comes, he finds some way to gently make fun of the way I've introduced him. So I'm really curious what he's going to say tonight. His new book, Phase 6, is a spare and gripping novel about the next pandemic. It's this book. I have it. I'm really, really excited about it. It was completed before COVID-19 even emerged, but it reads like a fictional sequel to our current crisis. The book has been praised by fellow authors, including Colin McCann, Margot Livesey, and Karen Russell, who says, if you've been waiting for the great novel of the COVID-19 era, it's in your hands. I mean, if you're holding this, presumably. With heroic humor and a poet's ear and eye for what makes humanity worth saving, Shepard's polyphonic novel of contagion and collapse is also the story of love's unlikely survival in the most hostile conditions. So you're in for something really special tonight. Jim's going to read from the book, and then he'll be talking with Ethan and then answering your questions. Please join me in welcoming Jim Shepard. Take it away.
Well, I don't have a single complaint about that introduction, Jess, so congratulations. Once again, you've covered yourself with glory. Here's the not so secret plan. I'll read a little bit from the very beginning of the novel, maybe 5 minutes or so. I'll skip around. You might detect some gaps, and you should imagine them filled with the kind of prose you prefer. And then Ethan will join the discussion, and things will get a lot more interesting immediately. But here's the way the novel begins. And this might save you a lot of time if the first part of it doesn't please you. It had gotten colder overnight, and the gravediggers had had to use a pneumatic drill. Alec had had to listen to it all morning. The Lange family all stood off to one side of the shallow hole with the coffin in it, while their kids played around the graves. Malik asked, without looking up, if Alec wanted to join the club called Everyone Hates Alec. And Alec watched 2 3-year-olds down the hill piss on the same spot in the snow and said he was already a member. Some of the grave sites had little white fences around them, and some were just white crosses among the rocks. Some of the graves had seashells on them, and some had plastic flowers or wreaths. While a minister talked, Alec and Malik scrolled through pictures of other people's pets and vacations. By the time the minister finished, it was sleeting. So when the service was over, a lot of people headed back to their houses, and the family almost had to fill in the grave alone. When Alec looked back, the wind was blowing even the frozen dirt off their shovels. When he looked back again, halfway down the hill, they'd finished with the dirt and had rolled all the large stones on top and were posing for their photographs with their hoods up. An older kid named Tavik was ahead of them heading down the hill. Want to see the most stupid expression in Greenland? Malik asked him. When the kid looked up, Malik pointed at Alec. Some 15 years earlier, the government of Greenland had announced that it had approved 4 times the number of mining exploration licenses granted in the previous decade. An Australian company had already begun zinc and lead mines on the northern coast, and 56 other active licenses were granted for gold, rubies, nickel, copper, and rare earth minerals, including neodymium, praseodymium, dysprobium, and terbium. The mines were promoted as contributing to the green economy, since 80% of the rare earth deposits would be used in wind turbines and hybrid cars and lasers. So the pitch became global warming in Greenland. We're part of the solution. Instead of publicizing a lot of moping and moaning Inuits trooping off to international conferences to lament the destruction of their fishing grounds, why not focus on the resources that native geologists were discovering every day under the vanishing ice sheets? Either you sat and just reacted to what was hurtling toward you, or you worked to get a hold of whatever opportunity brought along. Every settlement council had its visionaries who could anticipate hundreds of generated jobs and accompanying new airports and roads and hotels. When it was pointed out that 90% of the world's rare earth minerals came from China and that the environmental degradation that those mines had left behind was stunning, the glass half empty types were refuted with the reminder that the goal of self-sufficiency had to trump the notion of a continent changed beyond recognition, and were further chided that they couldn't live in a museum, and that the country was so huge, how could a few mines make a difference? Malik had liked what he'd seen in the new mining camp, 3 cargo containers with doors that he and Alec guessed were offices, and 2 tents on the bare rock around a big hole dug in the permafrost, with one of those sectional chain link fences that anyone could slide under. They visited the camp the next 4 nights, and on that 4th night, back on the dirt pile, Alec showed Malik a rock he'd unearthed with some digging that was glassy smooth on one side from the polish Ice Age glaciers had given it 11,000 years earlier. But what had also caught Alec's attention was a cavity where the surface had been spalled off, a scar of fractured crystals and feldspar and hornblende and ancient ice. Alec had been taken with the contrasting textures and had brought his friend's palm over to experience the difference between polish and edge. 2 days earlier, the drill bit's relentless pounding on the rock had finally broken the chemical bonds holding it to its ledge. And when that seam had cracked and the stress boundaries had separated, a cluster of molecules that had previously thrived in the respiratory tract of an early variant of the Bering goose, and that had been trapped with some throat tissue in the crystalline framework during the Holocene glaciation, had been reintroduced to the air and the warming sun. Even lying there in the darkness and dirt, Alec could smell them like heated metal. He had Malik smell too. Those molecules that were now released to become a part of something new. The next day, they both had sore throats and made fun of how much their noses were running. It rained so much you could hear the runoff on the road from inside the house. They went down to the water near the old halibut factory and sat in their favorite spot on one of the cement wharves built into the rock. Near where the cable for the hand winch for dragging boats or whales up onto the ramp ran into the water, a dead dog floated under the ice. Alec wiped his nose with his sleeve and then wiped Malik's. Around lunchtime, they walked back to the supermarket in the middle of the settlement and sat on the big flat rocks where the brook became a waterfall into the harbor. And some of the mine workers showed up and sat next to them and started eating and drinking. The wind off the water helped with the mosquitoes. 3 of the mine workers were white and 1 was dark-skinned. The foreman recognized Alec and nodded at him, and Alec and Malik were close enough to hear their talk. Some were speaking Danish and some something else. The foreman seemed interested in teasing them and kept running his hands through his own hair. So Malik pretended to be thrilled and told him, "You're so tall and handsome," and then was happy when the foreman and 2 of the men laughed. Then the dark-skinned worker showed them a funny video he'd taken of one of his drunk white friends falling down a flight of stairs, and the mine workers talked about getting to go home the next day. They were happy about it. Then the dark-skinned worker and Malik showed each other their phones, and the mine workers shared some Danish bread they had bought at the supermarket and some snow crab they had gotten at the tourist restaurant. Everyone loved the snow crab, and there was a lot of it, so it was passed around. And in that way, their shared fork became a fomite, from the Latin fomites, for tinder or fire starter, an object that when contaminated with an infectious agent will transfer that agent to the new host. I'm going to stop there. As you might guess, shit goes downhill from there, essentially.
Jim, that was great. That was wonderful. It,
Hi, Ethan.
Hi, how are you? How are you?
See you. Wait, before you say a word, can I just say, in terms of keeping priorities straight and continuing our log rolling, this is, as you already heard, ladies and gentlemen, an amazing collection. And it is one of the best collections I've ever read on the uncanny nature of parenting and the uncanny nature of storytelling. So you can even see one of my beagles loved it so much he ate it. He started chewing on it. That's how much he liked it. We don't really value books in this house. But anyway, we needed to start there because we may run out of time. We wanted to start with celebrating Ethan.
No, yeah, the dogs have really liked my book. The dogs have really responded to it. So that's really great. Thank you. It's wonderful. So let me sort of like let's roll that log off.
Roll that log back.
It's wonderful to see you. Congratulations on the book, which published yesterday, right? Yesterday was the book's birthday. And so we're going to try to avoid spoilers today so people can sort of get it. But you're not wrong. Shit goes downhill like really fast. And we love your work, and things just enlarge and sort of get worse. So I was going to start, and Jessica read, it's not a spoiler to sort of read a wonderful comment that someone has put on the back of your book, but she read the one that I was going to read, which is Karen Russell's sort of wonderful note about this book. In all of it, everything.
Do it because I can hear that phrase over and over again. So, you know, whatever you want to do there.
If you've been waiting for the great novel of the COVID-19 era, it's in your hands. I read Phase 6 with a galloping heart. And it's true. It's a wonderful novel. And it is about contagion and collapse. And it does do the incredibly good and hard work of pointing out the various inconvenient truths about the ways that we will most likely, even after going through our own very recent, still ongoing global pandemic, still not be ready for the next one. And it also does what I think is an incredible job of directing our attention to what, in the context of like a catastrophe of this scale, what does have enduring value. But it's a frankly terrifying book. I haven't stopped. So congratulations. No sleep over here. So I wanted to start sort of a little bit by just sort of talking about the process of writing this book. And I wanted to do this just by sort of telling a quick story. I've known you I've loved your work forever. And one of the readings that I saw you give, I think it must have been for the Book of Aron, which is just a fantastic novel as well. It has an ending that makes me weep every time I read it. and I do want to talk about endings, but we're not going to give no spoilers on this particular one. But during the Q&A for that one, you could sort of tell that at some point you were getting a little bit bored. It almost seemed like we were maybe you were like, "Whoa, what's your second favorite color?" Like we were sort of giving you the questions that you sort of don't always like live for when you're talking about your own work. And you started, it essentially just sort of stopped and said, like, you want to know what's really terrifying. Here's something that you should be worried about. You should really think about this. And you started talking about trains. And you started talking about sort of trains moving oil in trains and the way that they could sort of like level towns. And you must have been working on positive train control. It wasn't out yet. And we're also just sitting there, we're like, why is he talking about trains? It doesn't make any sense. And that story is a masterpiece. And one of the lines from that particular story that I've always loved is where they go sort of all sorts of things could have made this work safer, and deregulation gutted every single one of them, which is very applicable to the book that we're going to be talking about in a second. And I just remember sort of, we're like, what's he on about trains? And then literally a month later, that exact thing happened. A train sort of went and leveled a town, and tons of people died. And then just this week, there were 2 train derailments with hazardous material. And so, like, I feel like a little bit of we should have been paying attention to you then. I feel like maybe we'll pay attention to you now with this particular book. And I hope we will.
I guarantee you won't, Ethan.
Well, it's okay. Some lessons you have to learn over and over and over again. But one of the questions I have for you is, I'm curious about sort of the timeline for writing this particular book. It's about a pandemic. We're sort of in the middle of our own pandemic itself. But I'm curious about like when it was that you actually started this particular novel, and like what was the spark? And then I think that the second question that I'm really interested in know is, what was it like once you sort of, because I believe you had this book sort of drafted or mostly done once we sort of entered into COVID-19. And I was wondering if you could talk about that process a little bit.
Sure. I think it was maybe 4 years ago. I came across a story about out of Siberia about a 12-year-old boy who had died. And when the investigation pursued his death, it turned out that he had died of anthrax. And the Russians were floored by that because they hadn't had a case of anthrax there in 75 years. And it turned out after further investigation that the boy had been likely infected by anthrax spores that had been frozen in the permafrost, trapped in a reindeer carcass. And I had been following that particular line of apocalyptic thought for a while because the permafrost has been, as you know, the active layer in the permafrost has been getting larger and larger and larger, which means that every summer, instead of 3 inches of permafrost thawing, you're getting 7 or 8 feet of it. And added to that was the way in climate change, the northern reaches are being opened up to in terms of being ice-free now. And so both Russia and Greenland are aggressively mining, which means millions of tons of permafrost being dug up and piled next to mine workers who then scatter all over the globe. And I thought, well, this is not one of those if things, this is a when thing. And given, I mean, a lot of the stuff I write about, including the crude oil trains you were talking about, it's just shit that I find myself obsessively reading about anyway. So I think, well, I might as well try to deal with this somehow, in terms of my imagination. So I started to work on the novel, and I thought, and as is often the case, when I get interested in something like this, I go, Jesus Christ, you don't know anything about Greenland or Russia. You don't know anything about epidemiology. You don't know anything about emergency medical services. And so you have to learn all that stuff, or learn enough to present a persuasive illusion anyway. And so I started doing research. And you know how this works. In the middle of the night, I would lie there in bed going, you can't do this. You can't do this. And my wife, Karen, who's also a writer, would say very patiently, she would point out very patiently that I had said that about The Last Thing and that I'd been able to do at least something half decent anyway. And then I would point out logically that this was a very different thing. This wasn't like The Last Thing. And then she would model a form of patience and go back to sleep, essentially. And eventually, I finished the draft of this and I turned it into Knopf in February of 2020. And then the shit hit the fan, and Knopf was like, well, what are we going to do with this? And nobody knew, I think. Nobody had any good sense of, well, do we rush this out? Do we wait? At least of all me. And so the decision was made, well, let's sit on it for a little while. Let's wait. And that meant that in the long process of sitting on it and editing it and revising it, of course, COVID in some form had to be folded into the book as a pandemic before this pandemic, essentially. So that was the story of how that came to happen, essentially.
Well, in the process that that's really, you can imagine the marketing people just being like, this is the best, worst news we've ever had about a book. One of the questions that I'm actually though interested in as well on top of that is that then you've been writing about using your imagination to sort of project yourself into this sort of world of this particular pandemic. And then you were you found yourself sort of in it and then kind of making edits, perhaps sort of like on the fly. And I was wondering what the editing process was like, because COVID it's mentioned in this book, and the book takes place in some sort of pretty near future time, but COVID is in the critique that the book levels, I think astonishingly well, is the ways in which the COVID response has not been adequate, and perhaps we're not going to sort of learn very much from it. But the process of like, how did you decide what to sort of thread in or leave alone?
The key to a book like this, and it's a very difficult key to work out, I think, is how you mix the macro and the micro, right? Because you want to give a sense, how do you can't, it's a little perverse to just write about a pandemic simply from the worm's eye view of one person or something like that. But I'm very dedicated to the worm's eye view in a lot of ways, and I worked from the ground up. So I knew that would be a huge part of it. But I also knew that I had to provide some sense of an overview of the structures that allow something like this to happen. And striking that balance is not a very easy thing to do. In fact, some reviewers are like, oh, he struck such a beautiful balance. And others like, he didn't strike a beautiful balance at all. So everybody has a different idea as to how much macro and how much micro you want. I tend to be drawn more to the micro. Again, I start with the boy who's the index patient, and I very much focus on, 2 epidemiologists and 1 ER doctor, all of whom are women, and all of whom have no idea what's hitting them, essentially what they're confronting. And I just feel much more comfortable dealing with individual intimate psychologies. And one of the ways in which, given how dark a lot of the events in my fiction are, one of the ways in which that gets counterbalanced is the amount of compassion and tenderness, really, that's dedicated to the individual characters, so that you don't feel you're in the presence of misanthropy, and you don't feel you're in the presence of a very, very cold sensibility, but you do feel that you're getting some strong medicine, I suppose, in terms of some of the announcements that are crossing your path.
Yeah, that's my experience of reading this book. Exactly, it's strong medicine that is then, but it's tempered by these moments of like real tenderness. And Alec has my heart, his relationship with Malik, but also and it's really interesting. You talk about sort of the worm's eye view. You sort of have, and you go, this is sort of a pretty recognizable sort of care. In some ways, I was like, oh, it's Aron to some degree, and it's Alec's memories of once he sort of is stripped of everything. It's his memories that, for me, like sort of really opened up the book, and that's where I was sort of landing with my heart, like where I was sort of finding these moments of respite, even as he himself is kind of like, it doesn't get any worse than this, but he does still sort of have those. And then on top of that, you did layer sort of the macro stuff is really incredible. It's a detective story, essentially, and there's sort of a race against time. Mm-hmm. I thought you stitched them together beautifully. I really loved it.
You're saying so.
Yeah, no, it really is. And I'm not going to sort of spoil the ending, but the ending, again, was one of those things that sort of made you weep. And what these things, like, what I also really liked about this book, and I really felt, and I was like, I'm not sure that I'm ready, like, COVID is still going on. We've all sort of been flattened by it. We had the experience of how one of my kids got it. We went in sort of full lockdown. And the thing that I felt, I remember just like, I don't want to think about this anymore. I just don't. And I think that's exactly sort of the dangerous impulse that this book is sort of pointing out to us. And what I loved about this book is that it actually sort of, for me, it was like a really clear-eyed critique of this particular response, that what we've had sort of here in this particular experience. And what was sort of especially terrifying is that the novel is essentially saying, like, if you thought that this was bad, like, get a load of what's coming next. And it is definitely coming.
You know, the position of Cassandra is pretty much a dime a dozen. And by definition, you're the one who doesn't get listened to. And of course, it doesn't help that I'm operating in literary fiction, which, you know, has, how shall we put it, not spectacular reach in our culture necessarily. But all of that being said, there's a way in which the gap between who we are at our best and who we are most of the time is largest, perhaps, in the face of really dire stuff. And so what the dire stuff allows is glimpses into individual situations that are that can be quite heartening, even as the collective isn't learning, right? Even as we're making the same mistakes over and over again. You know, we all have that sense of being a part of society. Well, I know what we should do. Why isn't the group doing it, right? And you know, you can sort of model that in fiction, right? You can have Ethan as a protagonist figure out something that's quite smart and moving, and then you're like, yeah, but Ethan isn't running the world, so that's not going to matter all that much, right? That kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you keep writing short stories, I mean, who knows what'll happen?
Yeah, right. I mean, that could change everything.
Hey,
speaking of that, if I can do a little digression here, people might be interested in hearing that I think we have 2 short stories that are actually in conversation with each other. Is that your experience as well in terms of the actual title story of your story? It feels as though you have Franklin, you have Mount Erebus, we have you know the Franklin expedition story told 2 different ways in some ways.
Oh yes, like to the grandfather. Yes. That's yes, of course. I mean, it's a very Shepardian, it's a very Jim story. That one is but it's Jim's story by way of like a stupid person.
No, it's actually a kind of a very cool thing, right? To take the elements of one story and to do something completely different with it, right? But leave enough traces that people are like, hey, is this? I think I may have even told you this when we were working together, but at one point, a friend of mine, Ron Hansen, had written a story that I really, really liked with a protagonist that I thought was the kind of amiable lunkhead who gets America into so much sort of trouble. And so I made him a secondary character in a story of mine called Atomic Tourism. And both stories had appeared in the Atlantic. And it turned out that readers wrote in and said, hey, does Jim Shepard know that this is Ron Hansen's character? And of course, Ron and I had to write in and say, yeah, we actually are kind of, you know. And Charlie Baxter, one of your other old teachers, had one of my protagonists wander down a supermarket aisle. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
At the end of my second novel, Charlie was like, so you're going to tell me that this guy probably didn't survive, right? And I was like, well, what do you think? And Charlie said, well, I want him to survive. And I said, well, that's up to you. And then in his next novel, completely gratuitous, he just has my protagonist like walk down a supermarket aisle and introduce himself to his protagonist. And I'm sure I'm the only one who got the joke.
Yeah, still alive in this particular supermarket. Here we go. Now we know what happened.
Exactly.
Survived that particular thing. So we have a couple of Q&A questions that are going to sort of pivot. There was stuff that I wanted to get to also anyway for this particular. Right. There's one, and we can wrap up the research question, but one of the things that there's a note here from Edward, actually, is wonderful. First, a statement, Jim Shepard is a god, which we all know. And the second, I wonder if Jim could talk about sort of the research process for this book. And one of the things that I wanted to just kind of thread on top of Edward's question, you answered this like a little bit, but one of the great pleasures of reading your because you sort of always get to the end, and you do this in the short story collections too. In the acknowledgements, it's just sort of this, I mean, it's incredible. All the acknowledgements are just here, and you go like the amount of reading that is required to sort of generate what is very sort of a seamless story. They never feel overburdened to any degree. The question that I think we want to have is like, how did you know that, like, what was the most difficult part for you in terms of like research, in sort of like where there's kind of like happy surprises that really sort of altered the course of the book for you in terms of like the research process? The second thing has to do a little bit with this. I feel like there are very few, I mean, you mentioned Charlie Baxter, who's really great at writing stories and novels. I think there are very few people who can write both novels and short stories. I can't think of many who can write them as well as you. Like, you just sort of move between sort of both. But the amount of research seems to be that it's sort of equal to each, if you look on sort of the back. And so the question I've always wanted to ask is like, how do you know what goes into sort of a short story versus when do you know that you have enough to actually sort of pull it into a longer work?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, that last one. And in fact, the amount of research is often almost exactly the same. The aforementioned Ron Hansen came across my research folders for a story called Sans Farine, which was about a hereditary executioner during the French Revolution. And he was just aghast. And he said, you know, I could get a trilogy out of what you end up making it into a short story, essentially. And how I make that decision, is this going to be a novel or is this going to be a short story, often has to do, you know, a lot of times I'm trying to extend the reach of my empathetic imagination, and I'm putting myself into sensibilities that are pretty weird and sometimes off-putting. And like in the case of the hereditary executioner during the French Revolution, I was like, I don't want to spend 4 years with this guy. And I don't want to make a reader spend 300 pages with him, right? So I'm going to do a long short story in this case. In the case of, I had a novel, this probably the example that speaks most directly to your question. I had a novel called Nosferatu about the silent filmmaker F.W. Murnau. And that began as a short story about the making of Nosferatu. And it was a long story. And when I finished with it, I thought, I didn't get at everything I wanted to get at with this guy. I have to expand this. And it certainly wasn't a marketing idea. I wasn't like, you know, Nosferatu was such a bit, this will be better even as a, you know, seller as a novel. It was just like, no, I'm not finished with this. I want to do more with this, essentially. And that sense of, you know, in the case of something like the Book of Aron, you know, when you're thinking, well, you're going to be dealing with a child in the Warsaw Ghetto and Janusz Korczak, I was like, I can't do it in 50 pages. I can't do it in 40 pages, right? That being said, when I write these novels, they're very, very slim novels usually. You know, they tend to come in terms of manuscript around, you know, 220 or 230 pages, something like that, 240. Because I am really trying to make sure, going back to one of your other points and questions, that there's no details in there that are not moving the things forward emotionally. You know, writers are such pack rats that when we come up with a good detail, we want to use it somewhere because it's a good detail. And I try to be as ruthless as I can and sort of going, is this detail doing the same work another detail was doing? And if so, it's got to go, essentially. And it's not exactly like Killing Your Darlings, because unlike Killing Your Darlings, the Hemingway line, you know, he's talking about writers' narcissism about their own prose. In this case, it's an amazing detail that all of that research dug up, right? You're like, oh, this is such a great detail. But I really resist those 500-page or 600-page novels, which is part of why most people haven't heard of me, and which is part of why I'm wearing a cardboard belt, right? Because I think people like big, fat novels, and I don't write them. But if you write a big, fat novel, you can throw a lot more of those details in there. But for me, the hilarious extreme version of that is the James Michener thing, where you have, you know, 50 pages describing how the rocks that underlay Texas were formed before you even get to any human beings, you know, and you're just like, wow, we're in for the long haul here, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah. I like, even with the novels, I like to hit the ground running. And I like to move as, you know, I think of the kind of fiction that I find appealing is more, in terms of military analogies, a guerrilla action rather than, you know, an invasion or something like that. You know?
No, well, I mean, that's my experience reading it. Like, there are no authenticating details. The authentication comes from the emotional sort of surge that is sort of like informing the book, and those are in turn kind of shaped by the way that the research has sort of operated. And yeah, and you sort of on a for rocks. I also, that's a producer's reference, which is wonderful. Anytime a producer's reference is a happy day.
Right.
Tailing on this just a little bit though. So then I do have a question, and I feel like I have an answer for it, but I've always been curious what your answer for it would be, which is the sense of like, if novels, if you say like fiction is sort of there, and I think I've heard this sort of terrible phrase, but I can't kick it out of my head, to sort of entertain and instruct. One of the things that, and you also introduced me to Werner Herzog, who sort of has a really, a sense of like the ecstatic truth and stuff. You clearly could be writing sort of nonfiction. I mean, I think that you do more research than a lot of nonfiction writers in terms of just to sort of get the story where it needs to go. And I've always been curious, is like, what is it that you feel like fiction can do that nonfiction either can't or won't do? And is it more than just sort of like it just doesn't fit your particular sensibility, or is there a sense of that you're there?
I think it's the intimacy of the individual emotional life. The only way I can really do that as a nonfiction writer is to talk about myself, and that's I would rather shoot myself in the head. So that leaves invented human beings, and those invented human beings obviously have large stretches of me in them, but they also have any number of other human beings that I've been observing. And for me, I think that's a much more important part of a book like Phase 6 than even the pandemic details are. So if I'm writing about pandemics, even if I try to do that kind of nonfiction, it's like, Ethan Rutherford is on the front lines and we need to know him. There's a limit to how much I can get inside your head. And there's a limit to how much I can dramatize what else is going on in your life besides the pandemic. And in fact, there's a wonderful book out that hybridizes that way better than I ever could. Joanne Beard's book, Festival Days, in which, she has these essays that are, sort of nonfiction, but sort of not. I mean, the details are all absolutely correct for the most part, but she'll imagine the interiors of these people who are not her, which in traditional nonfiction is what we call the wrong thing to do. It can get you into trouble. But because she's working in a kind of a liminal genre, and because she's so good at it, and because she's so compassionate and intelligent, it works very, very beautifully. I would say, being a little bit more traditional, that if I had to define what she's doing, I would say it's fiction, essentially. That's beautifully researched. But she resists. She goes, no, it's right between. But I think that's what drives me to fiction, is that ability to inhabit a singular individual seems to me at least as important as the macro stuff.
It's what sticks with me. And it's also sort of what allows you to do what you do sort of at the endings. It's so sort of remarkable where just as things are sort of really closing down, things are enlarging on the imaginative scale to such a degree. And it's sort of, it's almost like a dolly zoom, if you could sort of call it that, where you just sort of have something is sort of closing down. We're getting very, very close to that felt experience, while we're also getting an expanding sense of this catastrophe that is sort of continuing to unfold. And
it's a way of playing with both the micro and the macro, right? The camera's moving in both cases. It's pulling out for the macro and it's zooming in for the micro. And the tension between those two in the prose is quite dynamic, right? And one of the other, Charlie Baxter is the one who said, oh, Jim, you're Mr. in media res when it comes to your endings, meaning you're always ending as something is happening as opposed to. And both of those techniques, if you can call them techniques, are my way of dealing with one of the most interesting aesthetic problems that the kinds of things I'm writing about creates, which is if you're writing about a famous catastrophe, whether it's Phase 6 or the destruction of the Hindenburg or the tsunami that destroyed the Minoan culture, the reader sort of goes, well, I think I know how this is going to end. And that skepticism on the part of the reader. That's sort of, well, how is he going to end this in a satisfying way? Is for me a really interesting and productive aesthetic question to set up and get rolling. And I love that readers are going along. Another friend of mine, Jeff Sanborn, who's an academic at Amherst, was reading my second novel, and he said, I'm sitting there reading it, and I thought, this son of a bitch has 1 page left. What on earth is he going to do in this 1 page that's going to cause this novel to end, right? Given where we are in the story, right? And I'm really interested in both the frustrations and the pleasures of that kind of question, planting in the reader.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that it goes, and then there's just like a little bit of a slip out of that slipstream for a second, and then there's sort of, I always feel instructed. I mean, instructed at the end of your stories and it's like my gaze has been shifted. This is what you should have been paying attention to, and it almost feels sort of like the gathering spot. And in that way, it feels like an incredible, not only like an arrival, but just sort of a wake up moment. Like, pay attention right here. We're clearing the ground, and it is that I call it the Scorsese zoom, and it's not. It's the Dolly zoom.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? And it's that you just go, things are really pressurized here. And this is the moment. I've done all of this sort of work to sort of get you to see exactly what this has been about for this entire time and what you're going to take with you. And there's a moment that I want to, and there actually is a question about cinematic technique, which is something I wanted to get to anyway. But I just wanted to read one of the challenges, I think, of this book, of Phase 6, that I thought you did incredibly well. It seems like really hard to write about something that is essentially invisible. You're only sort of writing about sort of symptoms and the effects that it has. It's sort of like a weird V2 rocket. Like, you don't hear, you just have the explosion, right? But what you're able to do in this book, I think, is great. And I just wanted to read a moment where one of the characters, I won't say who, it's not a surprise that there's a high body count in this book, in characters that you love in the same way that happened to all of us here. They get sick and you just go, it's it, right? There's nothing, you don't know necessarily where it came from, but you know that you have it. And the way that we experience this is really moving. I thought that it stays abstract and then is put in the body. So this is the character. She fell asleep, and this is someone that we've become very close to. She fell asleep almost as soon as she climbed into bed. When she woke up coughing, and headachy and sick, her sheets soaked with sweat. No, 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 she told herself, only half awake but petrified, and she stepped into the shower and scrubbed herself down as if that was all she needed to do. And she turned up the heat for the steam and still found that she had more and more trouble breathing, and she was still saying no to herself when she toweled down and climbed into her sweatshirt and back into bed and pulled the covers up to her face and then just went blank, waiting for the sun. I found that to be incredible. And you're also sort of breaking the normal syntax with the conjunctions. It's beautiful writing. And those were the moments, at least for me, that's the answer of the fiction versus nonfiction. Or sort of moments like that where you go, oh, that's right. That's what that panic feels like.
That's right. And that ability to have the interior insights in terms of what's going on viscerally with somebody, compounded by those conjunctions, by those simple conjunctions, was something that Hemingway taught me. Reading Farewell Arms, he just does an amazing job with that, and he was sort of obviously kind of famous for that. But what he would do is he'd take these little units of revelation, usually visceral revelation, which were intended to sort of suggest emotional revelation. And he would just string them together with these conjunctions. And the effect was, this is somebody who's open to experience, but not open to processing it. And that's, Nick Adams in a nutshell, right? And it's also, there's something hopelessly poignant about being inside a sensibility that is feeling, and feeling with that sensibility, but understanding that you might process it a little more complicatedly than they're processing it, right? And that's, again, one of the pleasures of interiority in fiction that is sort of wonderful for me. And if I were writing nonfiction, I would be making a claim about somebody else, right? I'm inside Ethan and he just doesn't process as well as I do. And you're like, well, that's not very generous.
Well, probably true, but yeah. No, that's right. It was, I have a question sort of about music, but I want to make sure that we get to this one in terms of like the music of the line, because I feel when you sort of unload like that, you just sort of have rhythm in the stresses. It's really incredible. And that's another way that you are so great at focusing attention. You do it like on the line level. But let's put that aside for a second and just everybody know that the writing, I don't think there's a better sentence writer in America. So buy the book for the sentences and for the absolutely terrifying feeling of
paragraphs will let you down, but the sentences you're going to love. I can tell you that.
Yeah, the sentences will grab you. This will turn you into a page hugger. So a question from Laura Tepper.
Hey,
this is Jim. Could you speak about the overlap between screenwriting or film studies in general in novel writing? Does one inform the other for you? And one of the questions, let me just sort of throw on top of this quickly. We'd already talked about sort of that technique of zooming in and zooming out simultaneously and the pressure that creates. I was also going to ask if do you think cinematically, do you think in cinematic terms, did you think in this book about crosscuts or those kinds of things?
Yeah, two different questions, but I can weave them together. In terms of your question, I think cinematically all the time. And part of the reason for that is part of my demographic is somebody who grew up with movies. I was steeped in movies. And in fact, my parents used movies as a babysitter for me a lot of the time. So and my brother is a movie fanatic, my older brother, and I became a movie fanatic. And we've seen, just a billion movies. So I've actually absorbed much more visual storytelling than I have storytelling in language. And partially because of that, I think, and partially because of who I am, I'm more attracted to that aesthetic problem of how do we figure out what's going on in Ethan's head by seeing Ethan behave, as opposed to long ruminative passages, sort of Henry James passages where we're inside Ethan and we're very finely explaining everything, right? The idea that there's a puzzle to be decoded is something that cinema is all about, right? I mean, you have a close-up of a face and you start projecting meanings onto it. You start trying to draw meanings from it. And so that and the visceral power of cinema, I always am trying to render in prose because I grew up with it and I love it. In terms of Laura's question, screenwriting and prose writing obviously inform one another. Screenwriting is in some ways way more frustrating because part of what you're doing is you're making a blueprint, right? You're making a construction that'll theoretically allow somebody else's vision to take form. And you have to register that you're turning it over to somebody else. And you also have to register that a lot of the really, really fine details that you love to do in prose, somebody else is going to do that in visuals. So you don't get to do that, essentially. Screenwriting, I still very much like screenwriting, but I'm glad I'm not a full-time screenwriter for all sorts of reasons. My family would probably wish I was a full-time screenwriter, but I'm glad I'm a prose writer.
I'm sure they love you for exactly who you are, Joe. But a question that I have about that, I don't know anybody who writes dialogue like you do, though. And notably, there are very few long conversations of direct dialogue. And one of the things that I think that you are incredible at is kind of compressing what would be very sort of long conversations to essentially like reported dialogue with punctuation marks of directed dialogue, right?
Yeah.
Of direct dialogue where, and it's in everything is an arrow. Either it's an accusation or sort of a question. Like in other words, the dialogue seems to be about negotiating power. That the only dialogue we sort of see, it's very minimal and it's either directed sort of out at the world or it's directed back at the speaker.
Well, one of the things we always forget, I think, when we're writing, as opposed to when we're just telling a story, is how often when we're just telling a story, we radically summarize everything that we don't need, and we get right to the heart of the matter, right? So you're telling a story, and you're like, "So get a load of this, Jim. I'm talking to my mom, and she's talking to me about the fact that I haven't been home for a while, and she's talking about my health, and blah blah." And then she says to me, "You are a loathsome vermin fit only for extermination." That's what she said to me, right? Now you're only dramatizing one line, right? But so many people, when they try to start writing dialogue, they think, well, I need the whole build up to that, right? So it's like, "Hi, Ethan, what have you been doing?" "Oh, nothing much, Mom." And you get all of this stuff and you're like, well, wait, but there's a good line coming. That's not the way we usually tell ourselves stories. The way we tell ourselves stories is we fly through everything that isn't absolutely crucial. And it turns out that if you're paying attention, a lot of shit is crucial. So there's plenty to stop and spend time with, but almost none of it is throat clearing. Almost none of it is furniture moving. All of it is getting to the heart of the matter. And it's very hard as a writer to remind yourself of that, because you really do sort of dutifully feel like you got to world build, you know, you got to do all this horseshit to just get the scene set up. And you never tell stories that way. People would like, they beat the shit out of you if you told stories that way. Like, imagine just like, hey, everybody, you're not going to believe this. So I'm in my mom's kitchen, which by the way, is stucco and it has a really nice, you know, and you know, if you start to describe the kitchen, they're like, wait a minute, do I need to know this? Why are you telling me this, right? And we have that instinct that infallibly when we tell these stories, and then we sit down to write and we fuck it all up.
Well, right, you're talking about the Mishner rocks again. You're like, oh, my trip to Hawaii, but before we get there, does volcanic stuff sort of happen?
Yeah.
But it's incredible to see the way in which that operates sort of on the small level, like in dialogue as well, right? It's not just sort of pulling authenticating details sort of out. It actually sort of works in dialogue. And I think it's incredibly instructive. And it also leads into the other question that I had, which is, you know, there's that sense of, and it's not sort of a Shepard moment, just when the mother goes, well, you're a vermin, you know, marked for eradication. The person who receives that has to be like, tell me something I don't know. You know what I mean? Like there's always sort of this spot. And a question I have for you, because I know that you listen to a lot of music and you care about music, and you wrote an amazing story narrated by John Entwistle, you know, of The Who, which is talk about like a worm's eye view of an incredible guy. But I was wondering, your writing feels really musical to me, but I don't necessarily hear melody. I feel like what I hear is rhythm. And in some ways, particularly sort of in the dialogue, you would almost go rim shot, rim shot, rim shot, sets up for like a kick drum, which is sort of like the kick in the heart, essentially. Like it, and you don't leave without that kick drum. I think it's incredible. But I don't know if that's just me sort of, because I really love music and I try to sort of read that into work. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think about music in terms of putting it on the page.
You know, that distinction between melody and rhythm is a really interesting distinction in this case. And you are more fully trained, way more trained in music, in fact, than I am. I'm steeped in music, but as, you know, a sort of slack-jawed listener for the most part. I never tried to play anything. And I've always been very, very interested in the rhythm of prose. And a huge amount of the power of prose, it seems to me, comes from the syntactical rhythms. And I don't even know, I think because of my ignorance about music, I don't even know what would constitute a melody in music. And I do know enough about music to know that in larger musical structures, I often don't, you know, try to even construct, right? People will go, oh, that story of X's was symphonic. And I'll go, well, that's something I couldn't do. I'll tell you that right now. But where a phrase is leaving you, where a sentence is leaving you, where a paragraph is leaving you, is in many ways all about rhythm. And so most of the writers I know spend a lot of time reading the prose aloud, not only because you pick up horrifying things that you didn't see on the page, but also because it reminds you that this is something that the reader is experiencing rhythmically as well, even in their head as they're going along, right? And that's a huge part of the revision process, is getting the rhythms right, essentially.
Right, the ear's going to catch what your eye doesn't. I mean, you're going to hear it, and then you're going to know when it's right and when you can sort of move on in that way. I have a very sort of quick question about this, and then want to move quickly to the these epigraphs for this book. It's just, they're so wonderful. Do you, when you are reading out loud, do you put stress, when you're giving a reading, do you put stress marks on top of the?
I do. I put stress marks, and I also put marks to remind me to pause in various places. And I was giving a reading at Bread Loaf, and Ellen Bryant Voigt was reading after me, the poet. And she saw my manuscript page, and she said, give me that. And she snatched it out of my hand, and she said, you make all the marks poets make. I said, yeah, but you know, I don't have their gravitas. I just have their stress marks, essentially. But yeah, I'm always doing that because otherwise, I always imagine that what I'm reading is way more expressive than it actually is. Like I think when I'm hearing myself, oh, I think you're getting that intonation exactly right. And then I've occasionally recorded myself and then in horror said, okay, you're not getting the intonation right at all. And you're swallowing words and that kind of thing. So anything I can do to improve that, I'm doing by marking up the manuscript.
Well, and to have Ellen Bryant Voigt sort of be like, wow, like you're syntactic, like you're doing something. That's, I mean, that's really something from her.
Well, she was talking about marks, to be fair.
Oh,
So,
yeah. Yeah. She's like, oh, what pretty stress marks.
yeah, what pretty stress marks. If only I heard them.
I have one of it. So one of the readings that we went to, I bought a book and they must have just given me your reading copy. It has all your stress marks.
Oh, no kidding. Oh yeah, that's great.
It's like a really sort of incredible, like it's a cherished object. I was like, oh, that's, because I remember I was like, oh, that's how real writers do it. They think in stresses and they think in.
Well, that's how this writer does it anyway. I don't know about real writers, but that's the way I do it anyway.
Yeah.
And do you make stress marks when you read?
No, I mean, I do, like, I don't even know how to do that. I'm so poorly educated. You're my teacher. I'm so poorly educated. No, I do look for the pauses and I make sure that they're there, and then you invariably cut stuff out. But I should try. It's like my cherished. I love, and I was then imagining like how screwed you were for the next reading and had to like do it again. But I was like, wow.
You know who's famously and kind of wonderfully instructive about stresses is just read any like 2 pages of David Mamet, essentially, because he's wonderful on stresses. And he usually, he reminds you that by putting the stresses not exactly where you would expect them, you're getting, enormous eloquence, right? So me, you're talking to, right? And it's like, wait, there's 2? How did that work? That kind of thing.
Yeah, right. It's the Christopher Walken School of Acting.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Jim, we have time for, I think we're going to do 2 questions. So we'll sort of hit, I wanted to talk really quickly about the epigraphs for this book, which I think are really, they tell the story of the book. It's going to take me too long to sort of really hit all of them. I love the first one that you have sort of cut off and you sort of go looking for the rest of that quote, which is the first, we didn't see the hand in what happens. So we call certain events melancholy accidents, ... If, according to the Google machine, if you sort of look up what comes next, is you go, when they are the inevitabilities of our project. And we call other events necessities because we will not change our minds. And I can't imagine sort of a better epigraph for this particular book or for sort of your writing project sort of in general. Followed by this really wonderful quote about sort of the AIDS epidemic by Jonathan Mann, which is, you go, it's our responsibility to look, not to flee or hide, not to wish away or to separate. And that was instructive to me for this book, that the value in this book are those moments of connection, even if it's touching a name on a screen for someone's email, it counts and it really matters. And it's turning our attention to that. And then we have a really wonderful quote by Mike Tyson, which is like, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And I was wondering how long you've been sort of waiting to use that.
Well, you know what, the arc you're describing in the epigraphs, I had in mind as I was writing, and I wanted to start with the cavell, which is all about the gentle way in which we fool ourselves, right? We imagine they're just melancholy accidents, even though we generated them. And I wanted to move to the other one, which is all about, it's all about connection. It's all about not separating. When we take the measure of the AIDS epidemic, they will ask us, were we there for each other, kind of thing. And I knew I was going to end up with Louis Pasteur going, gentlemen, it is the microbes who are going to have the last word. And I thought, well, how do I get from C to D or B to D? And then I was like, oh, Iron Mike. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? Which is one of those lines he came up with, which, you can plug into almost any situation, really. I'm just glad I finally got Iron Mike worked into a Knopf book.
Yeah, well, you need a picture of him holding it up. Be like, no, it was great. The way that the epigraphs sort of tell and focus the story, I think it also works in terms of the titles and the subheadings. It's amazing. We're coming up on sort of the last minute here. And so maybe a question from sort of the next room over, I guess, which is from Karen, who asks, just how crucial is your wife to your writing. And I will also say, like, as before you sort of, I'm going to give you some time here to think about that. The way that you did the books, well, this book is dedicated to Mila, who's a teacher of yours, but that Karen sort of, the way that you honor sort of Karen in your acknowledgements is always.
Why don't you read, I think what Karen was angling for was that you would read my acknowledgement about Karen. So that's a really good place to end. Karen would often point out that ending with Karen is a good place to end.
I'll read
that acknowledgement.
My best Christopher Walken. So here we go. And as always, I want to celebrate my first and final reader, Karen Shepard, who remains justified in continuing to inform everyone within a 500-mile radius that she renovates me for the better day after day.
There you go.
That's really sweet.
We're not going to do any better than that as a final word, I think.
I don't think so. Jim, thank you. It's a wonderful book. Everybody, please go buy it and feel sort of the vibrating, humming sort of pressure and tension, but it's an amazing book.
Thank you. And congratulations again on your book. And let's get together in 3 dimensions as soon as we can.
Let's do it soon. Jessica, did you need to say any sort of final notes for folks?
I can't really add anything to that. That was a fantastic way to end. Link to see both Jim's and Ethan's book is right there in the chat, so don't miss out on your chance to spend some time with them. It's always worthwhile. Thank you guys so much. Have a great night.
Take care. Thanks again, Ethan.